Hi everyone, I'm Jane Palfreyman, Publishing Director at Summit Books, and I'm honoured and delighted to be here today with Sarah Walker, the author of the incredible debut novel, The Water Takes, which absolutely blew my mind, broke my heart, and it's also very funny. So just a few questions about this amazing book. Sarah, what was the first image that kind of sparked the idea for this book?
I was at home during COVID and feeling very tetchy, and I was sitting on my sofa in the living room and thinking about how we couldn't really go anywhere and that we were in this strange state of disaster, but the way to respond to disaster was to just shelter in place. And I sort of started thinking about what does it look like when something's going really, really wrong, but instead of going out to solve the problem, there is this kind of urge to stay in. And so I think that kind of sense of everything being really uncertain in COVID and the sense of being sort of confined to the space of my house was the sort of feeling of it. And then the first image for the book, I went back recently and looked at the first thing I wrote, which was actually the first kind of preface scene in the book, which is Pam's husband, Thomas, watering the tomato plants. So that's kind of where those images sort of started coming.
And when did you decide sinkholes were going to be part of it?
So around this time, a sinkhole opened in Geelong where I was living, and it wasn't a very impressive one. It was quite small, but the kind of shock of that, the intrusion of that in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable road started really kind of playing at the edges of my mind. I've always had a real thing about water as well, the idea of like water rising and dark water being a kind of metaphor for the unknown. And so the idea of a sinkhole just full of black water felt like a total representation of like anxious terror, like the total unknowable, the total unpredictable.
Yeah, and just such a metaphor for all the hideous things in the world, really, that are just under the surface.
Yeah.
So there's two main characters, an older woman and a young girl. Can you tell us a little bit about them and why you decided on that combination?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pam is the kind of lead protagonist. She's in her mid-70s. She's kind of grumpy. She's a widower. She's really no bullshit. I was really interested in writing a disaster story that had a character who wasn't physically capable of going on a heroic mission. And I also wanted a character who, I feel like sometimes when you read older characters, they feel a bit 2D, and I wanted Pam to have this very like rich inner life to make her very funny, but also to have these kind of blocks in the way that she thought about the world based on the things that had happened to her that she wasn't fully aware of. I really like that in a character, whereas a reader, you can sort of see how their reasoning works and they can't fully see that. And then Charlotte arrived as this kind of opposite to Pam, this force of kind of youth and naivety and joy that sort of pulls Pam out of her isolation and also provides this really interesting tension because you've got a character who's like, come on, like we need community, we need to follow where the people are, we need to see what's going to happen. And Pam is so the opposite of that. And that tension where in some ways Charlotte is kind of more emotionally capable than Pam, but Pam has this wealth of life experience. Like there's this kind of interesting tensions that start emerging around their power dynamics and who actually knows what needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean the tension and like they both show enormous courage in completely different ways.
Yeah.
But kind of in opposition to each other quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's so moving. So what do you want readers to take away? What would you like them to remember when they finish the book?
I think as we live in a time that is increasingly unpredictable, this was a phrase that came out in COVID as well, there's these uncertain times, which I think has really continued in so many ways, climactically, politically, socio-politically. And I think it's really interesting to start thinking about what we need in terms of disaster. I spent a lot of time around this period thinking about apocalypse prepping. And there tends to be two kind of schools of apocalypse prepping, and they are often split along gendered lines. So typically you'll have your mask prepper who is like, we're getting guns, we're bunkering down, we're like going out on the hunt, everybody's an enemy. And then you have female preppers who are like, we need community. We need to make friends with the neighbours. We need to know that we can rely on each other and trust each other. We need education. We need to remember how to cook and how to grow things. And that schism became really interesting in COVID because you couldn't just go and like be heroic. You had to just kind of be kind to people. And the way that you had to deal with disaster was just by thinking about other people, which some people, it seems, rather struggled with. And so I think I'm interested in, okay, if we're looking at an increasingly unpredictable future, my friend David Finnegan, who's a climate science communicator, talks about we're not waiting for this apocalyptic moment. We're in it. This is the climate era. We will live in increasingly uncertain times with these shocks that kind of impact us. So what do we need? We need agency, but we need community. We need care. We need people to know how to look after each other and how to attend to each other in what is quite an atomized capitalist world, which is really hyper-individualistic. This idea of the individual only survives when the community survives, I think is really important.
So there's a great tension in the book between kind of dread and tenderness, but there is also humour. And how did you find the balance between those three things? Because the humour really makes it possible to read and enjoy a story that is, you know, quite sad on some levels and totally scary.
Yeah, I think I've always been quite attentive to the humour and the absurdity in any given dramatic situation. Like I really notice that when I'm in a moment that otherwise feels like it should be quite cinematic, a death or like a breakup, there's always some feature that doesn't fit in the image. Like, you know, there's like a dog throwing up in the corner, or someone farts at the funeral, or there's just some little like...
Or giggles.
Yeah, totally. There's some like fracture in the expectation, and I really like that. I think it really humanises experience, and I think about that a lot in writing of humour, not just as like a deflective coping strategy, but actually is a really important coping strategy, because humour fundamentally is about incongruity of like what you expect versus what is actual. And I think it's a really useful way of dealing with trauma and horror, to just be like, just have these little moments where you're like, this is wild, what's going on? And there is, you know, there's so much life in chaos. And it felt really important for me that both of the characters have these moments of laughter and levity, because in really awful situations, that is often the way that we remind ourselves of our humanity and our selfhood. And I think also as a person who is very anxious, that kind of like feeling of underlying dread attends a lot of my life. And I think for a lot of people, there is that feeling of like,
Absolutely.
I think something is going to go wrong. I don't know what it is, but something is going to go wrong. And the sort of the cyclical nature of emotionality in a heightened event, that it's never just horror or just levity. There's always this kind of shifting that goes on. And I really like that as a reader as well, when you're kind of sloshed around in the washing machine of emotions. And, you know, it's a classic notion that the highs are higher and the lows are lower when they're in opposition to each other. Yeah. And I think it's much easier to care about Pam because you love her, because she's very funny and very sort of self-deprecating.
Yeah, she is. And she turns a lot of that humour on herself in her kind of internal monologue.
Yeah, totally.
You know, ridiculous old woman, you know, cranky old bitch.
Yeah.
She knows exactly what she is, but I feel like she kind of uses that to rev herself up sometimes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Some people work well with positive reinforcement. Pam sort of does a bit of kicking the dead horse of her own psyche.
Yeah, well, she can't kick the young girl. Yeah. So, you know. So you're also an artist, a great photographer, who uses comedy and surprise to address serious topics. Can you talk about that in relation to the water takes?
Yeah, it's been interesting because as I've been writing the book, it's been sort of happening in parallel with my PhD, which is using these actually quite narrative approaches around narrative freeze and descriptive excess, and sort of like that feeling of being frozen in too muchness, which is what anxiety feels like to me. And also about the idea of specifically the type of anxiety that comes when you don't know what is coming. So, you know, if someone says, okay, there's going to be a hurricane in 24 hours, you're like, right, well, there's tasks I can do. But that feeling of like, just constantly being on edge, waiting for something to happen, is that space that I'm addressing in the PhD as well, through video art, in which I perform and kind of make a bit of a clown of myself. And yeah, so those things have kind of progressed in a similar way, with this real focus on, okay, how do we use levity to kind of bring people closer? Because traditionally, if something happens and you go, you'll either, if it's funny, you sort of lean in, you're closer to it, or if it's horrifying, you'll lean away. And so that is that's the sort of like the dance of the book and of art, where you're saying, okay, like we can talk about it, that using humour allows shame to sort of dissolve to some extent. And then once you're close, you can sort of say, okay, well, like what happens when the water runs out? Like how are you coping with that? What are you eating? This sort of notion of allowing people that sort of sense of flow and breathing in and out and closer to the work and then away from the work. And I really like that humour, I think, and making something ridiculous, not silly, but allowing it to be absurd, sort of shatters something where a lot of people, when they see my work, go, oh my God, I have felt exactly like that. And what I'm representing is something really, really, really outrageous. Like I'm really pushing the envelope of what that anxiety is. And people really respond to it because they're like, it does feel that catastrophic for me sometimes. So yeah, I think sometimes when you're sort of throwing a ball so far away, you're actually giving people so much room to meet you. If you're like, I feel like this, and this is what you're meant to feel like socially, people can be like, oh, actually, I'm in that space in terms of feeling really overwhelmed.
Oh, I'm sure you get that kind of feeling that people allowing them, your work allows people to allow themselves to express what they really feel.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and literature is so good at just allowing you to dig into a concern that you have, and so many of my own anxieties and phobias and fears are in this book, sort of expressed through Pam, who is kind of actually very much how I imagine myself as an older person.
Yeah, kind of. It's very hard to not see yourself as Pam.
Yeah.
So about the title and the nature of water in the book, without giving too much away, it's a very powerful medium, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it does things to people.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have always been really interested in flood mythologies and water mythologies, and how as humans we relate to water. We evolved from water, we are of water, we are 60% water, et cetera, but it has this kind of hold on us as a representation of nourishment, but also of danger. And I think there's, it's sort of tied in with the notion of like motherhood and caring and amniotic fluid. Yeah, there's all these, it's such a rich site for play. And I think maybe this is also partly because I grew up as a child going up to the Murray River to visit my grandma, had a holiday house up there, and that water is just so dense. You cannot see through it. If your hand is this far under the water, you can't see it. And the idea of unseen things being in the water is it's a real fundamental horror for me. And so in the book, the water kind of, it sort of calls to people. There is this kind of exchange that happens with people who are able to sort of read what's going on with the water. It becomes this almost sort of like spiritual representation of the fundamental unknown. And the ability to kind of attend to that unknown provides possibility in the book. Yeah. The title, actually, I really struggled to come up with a title for this book.
It's a great title, I think.
Thank you.
Because it's so fascinating.
It was actually my husband who came up with the title. I had this enormous document on my phone with all these different titles, and he would just sort of like turned around on the couch one day and said, "The water takes," and I was like, yeah. I like that there is a kind of implied resolution to that phrase, which is that the water also gives, which sort of becomes a feature in the work.
So Sarah, if you were trapped in suburbia and knew that down a sinkhole somewhere there might be a way of getting some food, some cans or whatever from one of the supermarkets, what thing or item would you go for first if you were the one to do that?
Okay, so look, ideally, when stuff starts happening, when stuff starts going wrong, you want to go to Bunnings, you want to go to a chemist, and you want to go to a food store. So, I mean, it depends what we're dealing with. I've irrationally thought about this quite a lot in terms of a zombie apocalypse. Like, what do you need from Bunnings for a zombie apocalypse? You need ranged weapons, so you need big bottles. Okay, sinkholes are happening. I mean, I think really boringly, a lot of the answers to this would be like antihistamines, painkillers. I think you'd be really fighting people for medication. I reckon the Valium at the chemist is really, it's getting looted pretty quickly. If I had to eat one tinned food that I had to rely on, look, I don't mind a baked bean. I actually quite like cold baked beans as well, which is quite controversial. And I think probably what I wouldn't think to do but would regret afterwards would be to just get heaps of containers of bottled water. I really dislike bottled water. Whenever I know people who buy little bottles, I'm like, we have great tap water in this country. But yeah, I think you'd want water because it's going to get pretty dicey pretty quickly otherwise.
Yeah. So what would you ask the next writer in this series? What burning question would you ask them?
I think I'd like to know what is a book or books that you wish you'd written. Yeah, I think it reveals a lot about writers to know the books that they're like, I wish that had been me.
I have to ask you that question now.
I think Sarah Krasnosten's The Trauma Cleaner is one that I read and was like, oh my God, this is an extraordinary book and I wish I'd written it. I actually met the trauma cleaners who run the company that she wrote about, and I was like, hi, I know all about you. Really exciting to meet you. We had a great chat about ghosts. It was great. And then also The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. That lead character is just so unable to see his own foibles. It's like his attention is so directed, and you're reading the book being like, she loves you, you idiot. You're grieving, you idiot. And that capacity as a writer to create a character who's totally unaware of what you as a reader are aware of, I just think is just magnificent. It's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Great answers. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Absolute pleasure.
Everyone, this book is a masterpiece. Just read it is all I can say. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.